There's no difference in the norms, and that's really interesting because I would have expected to see a difference there. And so that didn't exist. There's not just a mean difference in perceptions of norms between the two groups of people. And there was a significant difference in religiosity. So the Latina women reported that religiosity was more important to them than my white participants did. So the first thing I did on that last slide was just look at, are there mean differences between the two groups and some of my constructs? The next thing I did was look at which of those constructs were important for predicting vaccination. And so what I found is that individuals who had higher HPV knowledge, those who were more likely to communicate with their mothers about sex in relation to values, and those who had higher descriptive norms were more likely to be vaccinated. Descriptive norms refers to whether or not I know people who got vaccinated. So descriptive norms refers to, do I know friends, family members, or peers who have received the HPV vaccine? And that was important for whether or not they themselves had received the vaccine. But what I was really interested in is looking at the interactions. So we have these variables and these constructs, but what I really want to look at is, are these constructs affecting HPV vaccination differently among my two groups of participants? So the first one that I have is age of first intercourse. So age of first intercourse by itself was not a significant predictor of HPV vaccination. There was a mean difference between the whites and Latinas, but there was no differential effect on just vaccination. But this analysis shows that Latina women who initiated intercourse at later ages in life were the least likely to have received the HPV vaccine. Whereas among my white participants, age of first intercourse doesn't seem to really affect whether or not they got the vaccine. So they were equally likely to get the vaccine whether or not they had their sexual debut earlier or later in life. The communication about sex in relation to values is probably one of the most interesting findings because it shows that among the white participants, those who had the most mother-daughter communication about sex in relation to values were the most likely to be vaccinated. So among the white individuals who are talking with their mothers about sex and values a lot, those women were the most likely to have received the HPV vaccine. Among the Latinas, the women who had spent the most time talking about sex in relation to values were the least likely to have been vaccinated. So if we had just looked at communication overall, we wouldn't get the same picture of what's going on here. And I don't know, I can only speculate about this, but I'm assuming that what's being communicated in terms of values between the two groups is different. So obviously when white women are talking to their daughters about sex and values, they're communicating something differently than what the Latina mothers are communicating to their daughters, and that's having a differential effect on their health protective behaviors. Again, this is the descriptive norms, and this is interesting because among my white participants, whether or not you know a lot of people who have received the vaccine does not seem to affect whether or not you got the vaccine. So you either know a lot of people who got it or you know a few people who have gotten it, and you're equally as likely to have gotten it yourself. But among my Latina participants, if they reported knowing only a few people or no people who have gotten the HPV vaccine, then they were the least likely to have received that vaccine. So clearly, knowing people who have received the vaccine is affecting these two groups of individuals differently and having a different effect on their preventive behaviors. And finally, I included religiosity. I don't have time to go into it a lot, but there's only a tiny bit of research on religiosity. And among my participants, you can see that, again, the white participants who reported the highest degree of religiosity were the most likely to have received the HPV vaccine, whereas the Latina women who reported the highest degree of religiosity were the least likely to have received the vaccine. So again, this very simple construct that gets thrown into a lot of research studies is operating quite differently among the two groups with respect to their vaccination behaviors. So I had to race through this. I thought I had twice as much time as I actually did, so I'm sorry if it seemed a little bit rushed. But this is one of the first studies to examine HPV among a community sample of white and Latino women. There are virtually no other studies that do this. There are studies that include white and black women, but there are really no studies focusing explicitly on this disparity as it relates to cervical cancer. And so that's a real strength of the study. It's also one of the first studies to include constructs like mother-daughter communication, norms, and religiosity, things that, according to my data, appear to be important for whether or not women receive the vaccine. So again, that's another strength of this research. I think the main take-home message is that we had all of these public health campaign ads about one less, be one less. And I remember those very vividly. But clearly, the effectiveness of that dissemination was not equal across both groups. The Latino women reported having less knowledge. So the dissemination was not necessarily as effective for all individuals. And I think the conclusion that we can draw from that is that the public health messages need to take into consideration these sociocultural differences when they're considering their public health campaigns, because what we think might be the pattern of data for one group is clearly not necessarily the pattern for all groups of individuals. And the current research has not highlighted those differences so far. And I think they're very important, and we can help get women to become vaccinated at a higher rate to protect their health. So kind of the reason that I got connected with the Division of Latina Affairs is because I'm planning my next study on this same topic, and I wanted to reach a broader pool of potential participants. So I am including my recruitment flyer in the next outgoing newsletter, and I hope to collect data from 600 participants. And this time I'm trying to collect data from men. And I don't have time to go into it a lot, but the male HPV vaccine was recently just approved, and we know that a woman's risk of getting HPV is not just predicted by her own sexual risk-taking behaviors, but also those of her male partner. And so there are very few studies that look at men, and the ones that do tend to look at homosexual men exclusively. And so there's not a lot of research looking at how do heterosexual men perceive HPV, do they perceive it to be a risk, and do they think that they're under sort of any obligation to help protect their female partners? And then are there sort of race differences and gender differences in some of the constructs that I've included here? Okay, so thank you for your time. I feel very honored to have been included in this group of presenters. My former advisor at Iowa State told me that I'm just some white girl trying to capitalize on their experience. So I hope that's not how it comes across. If you have suggestions about other things that could be useful to be included or other directions I should go, I'm really open to hearing that, because like I said, I have a lot to learn about this, but this is sort of what I know so far. So thank you.